The gavel slammed down, echoing through the stifling courtroom. Two smug patrol officers sat in the gallery, snickering at the quiet black man in the defendant's chair. They thought they had framed a nobody. They didn't know they had just perjured themselves in front of the director of the FBI. It was a muggy Tuesday evening in Oakhaven, a mid-sized county that had recently become a glowing red dot on the Department of Justice's radar. David Sterling navigated his unmarked, slate-gray Ford Explorer down the desolate stretch of Route 119. At 58, David possessed a quiet, authoritative demeanor, characterized by graying temples and a sharp, calculating gaze. Just 3 months prior, the United States Senate had confirmed him as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating out of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. But tonight, he wasn't wearing his tailored D.C. suits. He wore a faded polo shirt, comfortable khakis, and wire-rimmed glasses. He was driving alone, returning from a quiet, unpublicized review of a regional field office in a neighboring state. Oakhaven had a reputation. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had recently compiled a disturbing preliminary report on the local police department. The statistics were glaring and concrete, painting a grim picture of systemic abuse. Within Oakhaven County, African Americans made up only 14% of the population, yet they accounted for 82% of all vehicular searches, 71% of reported use of force incidents, and 67% of pretrial detainments. The local police department operated like a rogue, uniformed cartel, funding the municipality through predatory citations, targeted arrests, and aggressive civil asset forfeitures. David wanted to see the terrain himself. He hadn't planned on becoming a statistic on his drive back to the capital, but a career spanning 3 decades in federal law enforcement meant he was fully prepared for the possibility. The harsh glare of red and blue lights suddenly strobed in his rearview mirror. David checked his speedometer. He was going 43 in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. He signaled, smoothly pulling the Explorer onto the gravel shoulder. He placed his vehicle in park, rolled down the window, turned on the dome light, and placed both hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He waited. In the side mirror, he watched 2 figures step out of a heavily tinted cruiser. The primary officer, a bulky man with a tight buzz cut, approached the driver's side with a practiced swagger. His hand rested casually on the butt of his unholstered Glock. The secondary officer, younger and wiry, mirrored the approach on the passenger side, shining a blinding tactical flashlight into the cabin. "License and registration," the bulky officer barked, making no introduction. His name tag read Mitchell. "Good evening, officer," David said, his voice even and calm. "My license is in my wallet, in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" Officer Thomas Mitchell scoffed, exchanging a look with his partner, Officer Bradley Hayes, across the roof of the car. "Just get the license, slowly, no sudden movements, or we're going to have a very bad night." David complied, retrieving his standard Washington, D.C. driver's license. It read simply, David Sterling. It carried no titles, no federal insignias. To the untrained eye, he was just an older black man, far from home. Mitchell snatched the plastic card, shining his light directly into David's eyes. "Long way from home, Washington. What's a guy like you doing driving through my town at 11 at night?" "I'm just passing through on my way home," David replied, squinting slightly against the glare. "Was I speeding, officer?" "You drifted over the yellow line," Mitchell lied without missing a beat. "And your taillight is flickering. Plus, I smell marijuana. Step out of the vehicle." It was the classic pretextual stop. The trifecta of unverifiable claims designed to manufacture probable cause. "Officer Mitchell," David said, keeping his tone perfectly neutral, "I assure you, I have not consumed any marijuana, nor is there any in this vehicle. I respectfully decline to consent to any searches." Mitchell leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and tobacco. I wasn't asking for your consent, boy. I have probable cause. Step out of the car, or I will drag you out through this window. David did not argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out into the humid night air. Hayes immediately grabbed him, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the hood of the Explorer. The metal was still hot from the engine. Hayes roughly kicked David's legs apart and began a highly aggressive pat-down. "Nothing on him, Tom," Hayes reported. "Keep an eye on him," Mitchell said, drawing his flashlight and leaning into the driver's side of the Explorer. David stood silently against the hood. He did not protest. He simply watched the reflection of the flashing lights on the wet pavement, his mind cataloging every civil rights violation, every procedural failure, every breach of the law. A few minutes later, Mitchell emerged from the vehicle. In his gloved hand, he held up a small, clear, plastic baggie containing a white, crystalline substance. Well, Mitchell sneered, holding the baggie up to the light. "Looks like we caught ourselves a trafficker, Brad. What do you think this is? Meth? Crack?" David looked at the baggie. "That does not belong to me. They always say that." Hayes laughed, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Save it for the judge, buddy," Mitchell said, stepping forward. "David Sterling, you are under arrest for possession of a Schedule II controlled substance with intent to distribute." Hayes grabbed David's wrists, yanking them painfully behind his back, and ratcheted the handcuffs on tight enough to bite into the skin. "I would strongly advise you both," David said quietly as he was shoved toward the back of the cruiser, "to reconsider this course of action and think very carefully about where that evidence came from." "Shut up," Mitchell snapped, pressing a hand firmly down on David's head to force him into the plastic back seat of the cruiser. "You're in Oakhaven now. You don't give the orders here." As the heavy door slammed shut, David Sterling leaned back against the hard plastic seat. He wasn't angry. He was deeply, profoundly focused. The trap had been set, but the officers hadn't realized they were the ones who had stepped into it. David spent the night in a cramped, foul-smelling holding cell in the Oakhaven County Jail. He politely declined his single phone call until 6 a.m. the following morning. When he finally requested the phone, he dialed a secure, unlisted number in Washington. "Fletcher." A crisp voice answered. "Simon, it's David," he said calmly. "I'm going to be delayed returning to the office. I am currently incarcerated in Oakhaven." There was a brief pause on the line. Simon Fletcher, the deputy director of the FBI, rarely missed a beat. "Do we need to send a tactical team to extract you, sir?" "No," David replied. "I want to let the Oakhaven judicial process play out. Leave me in the system as a civilian. Notify the Office of the Inspector General and the Civil Rights Division. Tell them to stand by for a massive evidence dump. I'll need a local suit dropped off at the courthouse before my arraignment." "Understood, sir. Happy hunting." 30 days later, David Sterling sat at the defense table in the Oakhaven Municipal Court. He wore a modest, off-the-rack gray suit that Simon had couriered to him. The courtroom was a grand, wood-paneled relic of the 1950s, smelling faintly of lemon polish and institutional decay. The atmosphere in the room was painfully casual. In the gallery, half a dozen uniformed officers sat drinking coffee, laughing, and chatting loudly. Among them were Officers Mitchell and Hayes, looking particularly smug. They viewed court appearances as overtime pay and an opportunity to watch their victims squirm. At the prosecution table sat Richard Conley, an arrogant, sharply dressed man who had built a lucrative career securing rapid plea deals out of frightened defendants. He had already approached David twice that morning, offering a generous deal: 5 years of probation, forfeiture of the Ford Explorer, and a felony conviction on his record in exchange for avoiding jail time. David had politely declined, insisting on representing himself pro se in a preliminary evidentiary hearing. Judge Harrison Caldwell emerged from chambers, his black robe billowing. He was a man deeply embedded in Oakhaven's corrupt ecosystem, known for rubber-stamping police testimony and bullying defendants into submission. "All rise," the bailiff droned. Judge Caldwell sat heavily, shuffling his papers. State of the heavily burdened taxpayer versus David Sterling. Charges are possession with intent to distribute. Mr. Sterling, I see you've refused a public defender and rejected the state's generous plea offer. Are you certain you want to waste the court's time representing yourself? I am certain, Your Honor, David said, standing up respectfully. Very well. Let's get this over with. Prosecution, call your first witness. The state calls Officer Thomas Mitchell, Conley announced smoothly. Mitchell strode confidently to the stand, winking at Hayes as he passed the gallery. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, taking his seat with practiced ease. Under Conley's direct examination, Mitchell painted a vivid, entirely fictional picture. He described a dangerous traffic stop. He claimed David was driving erratically, sweating profusely, and acting with extreme hostility. He testified that upon smelling narcotics, he conducted a lawful, probable cause search and found 3 grams of methamphetamine, clearly visible in the open center console. And did the defendant admit to ownership? Conley asked. He was uncooperative, belligerent, and made several threatening remarks toward myself and Officer Hayes. Mitchell lied smoothly. Thank you, officer. No further questions. Conley sat down, casting a condescending smirk toward David. Mr. Sterling, Judge Caldwell sighed, looking at his watch. You may cross-examine. Keep it brief. David stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked slowly to the podium, projecting the image of a nervous, out-of-his-depth civilian. Officer Mitchell, David began, his voice mild. You testified that I was sweating profusely and acting hostile when you approached my vehicle. Is that correct? That's right, Mitchell said, leaning back. You were clearly under the influence, or panicking. I see. And you stated that the suspected narcotics were found in plain sight in the open center console? Yes. Officer Mitchell, did you or Officer Hayes activate your body-worn cameras during this encounter? David asked. Mitchell sighed, an expression of feigned regret crossing his face. Unfortunately, due to a technical malfunction, my camera did not activate. Officer Hayes's camera was dead because he was at the end of a long shift. A technical malfunction, David repeated, nodding slowly. How unfortunate. So, there is no video record of me swerving, acting violently, or of the drugs sitting in the open console. My testimony is the record, sir, Mitchell fired back, his tone hardening. David looked down at his legal pad. Officer, I want to be absolutely clear. You are testifying, under oath, under penalty of perjury, that you did not plant the narcotics in my vehicle, and that your account of my behavior is entirely factual? Objection, Your Honor, Conley interrupted. The defendant is badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Caldwell growled. Mr. Sterling, watch your tone. The officer has already sworn to the truth of his statement. My apologies, Your Honor, David said smoothly. No further questions for this witness. Mitchell stepped down, looking triumphant. The state quickly called Officer Hayes, who flawlessly corroborated Mitchell's story. He repeated the lies about the body cameras, the erratic driving, and the hostility. When it was time for cross-examination, David asked only one question. Officer Hayes, when Officer Mitchell searched the driver's side of my vehicle, where exactly were you standing? I was standing at the rear right passenger door, maintaining a visual on you, Hayes answered confidently. So you had a clear view of Officer Mitchell as he conducted the search? Yes. Thank you. No further questions. Conley stood up. The state rests, Your Honor. The evidence is clear, and the officer's testimonies are uncontradicted. We ask that the case be bound over for trial. Judge Caldwell nodded, looking down at David. Mr. Sterling, the prosecution has presented a very solid case. Do you have any defense to present, or can we wrap this up? David took a deep breath, smoothing his tie. He stepped out from behind the defense table and walked into the center of the courtroom. The facade of the helpless civilian vanished instantly. His posture straightened, his gaze turned to steel, and the commanding presence of a man who oversaw 35,000 federal agents filled the room. "I do have a defense, Your Honor," David said, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "And I have evidence to present. Evidence that will prove that every word spoken by these officers today was a fabricated, malicious, and criminal lie." The courtroom fell silent. Mitchell and Hayes stopped smiling. Judge Caldwell frowned, leaning forward. "Watch yourself, Mr. Sterling," the judge warned. "What evidence?" "The state claims there is no video record of the incident due to convenient malfunctions," David said, turning his head slightly to lock eyes with Officer Mitchell in the gallery. "However, my vehicle was not a standard rental. It was a federal fleet vehicle, equipped with a concealed, continuous recording 360-degree biometric dash and cabin camera system, a system that uploads encrypted audio and video directly to a secure server via satellite." Conley dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the wooden table. David turned back to the pale-faced judge. "Your Honor, I call my first witness, Special Agent in Charge William Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Affairs Division." The heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. The casual, arrogant chatter that had previously filled the gallery evaporated in an instant. Striding down the center aisle was William Carter, standing 6'3", broad-shouldered, and wearing a meticulously tailored navy suit with a subtle, enameled lapel pin. Carter moved with the predatory grace of a man entirely in his element. He carried a heavy, reinforced Pelican briefcase. Prosecutor Richard Conley sprang to his feet, his chair screeching against the polished hardwood floor. "Objection, Your Honor. What is this? This man is not on the witness list. This is an ambush." Judge Harrison Caldwell slammed his gavel, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Mr. Sterling, what is the meaning of this? You cannot simply parade unlisted witnesses into my courtroom." "Your Honor," David replied, his voice a calm, immovable anchor in the sudden storm. Special Agent Carter was subpoenaed under a federally sealed writ, approved by a magistrate judge in the United States District Court. Under Rule 404 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, and given the nature of the defense I am compelled to mount against state officials, the seal was maintained to prevent the destruction of evidence. I have the unsealed orders right here. David approached the bench and handed a thick stack of watermarked federal documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Caldwell put on his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the pages. The color rapidly drained from his face. The seal of the United States Department of Justice glared back at him. I see," Judge Caldwell stammered, clearing his throat. The bluster had completely vanished from his voice. "The witness may be sworn in." William Carter took the stand, raised his right hand, and swore the oath. He placed the Pelican case on the ledge in front of him and popped the heavy latches. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," David requested, stepping back to the podium. "William Carter. I am the Special Agent in Charge of the Internal Affairs Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, currently assigned to a joint task force with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division," Carter stated, his voice booming effortlessly through the silent room. In the gallery, Officer Thomas Mitchell shifted violently in his seat. Officer Bradley Hayes looked as if he had stopped breathing. "Agent Carter," David continued, "can you identify the vehicle I was driving on the night of August 14th? "Yes, sir. It was a 2024 Ford Explorer, asset designation Foxtrot 7. It is a specialized federal fleet vehicle, assigned exclusively to senior executive personnel." "And can you describe the surveillance capabilities of asset Foxtrot 7? "The vehicle is equipped with a Level 4 Sentinel system," Carter explained, pulling a secure, military-grade encrypted laptop from the briefcase and connecting it to the courtroom's digital projector. It utilizes 6 concealed high-definition cameras, providing a seamless 360-degree exterior view, plus 2 cabin cameras. It records audio via parabolic microphones, sensitive enough to pick up a whisper at 20 yards. It also logs continuous telemetry, speed, GPS coordinates, steering angle, and brake pressure. This data cannot be altered, paused, or deleted by the driver. It is live-streamed via satellite to a secure server in Quantico, Virginia. Conley, the prosecutor, was visibly sweating now. He dabbed his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. "Your Honor, I must object to the introduction of this unauthorized surveillance. It violates state wiretap laws. Federal law preempts." "Mr. Conley," David countered sharply, not even looking at the prosecutor. "The vehicle is federal property, operating on a public highway. There is no expectation of privacy. Furthermore, 18 U.S.C. Section 2005-111 provides an explicit exemption for law enforcement officers acting under the color of law. Agent Carter, please play the footage from the night of August 14th. Carter tapped his keyboard. The large screen behind the witness stand flickered to life. The courtroom was suddenly staring at a crystal-clear, multi-angle view of Route 119. The telemetry data at the bottom of the screen showed the Explorer's speed locked steadily at 43 miles per hour. The steering wheel graphic showed 0 erratic movements. The vehicle was perfectly centered in its lane. "As the court can see," Carter narrated, "the telemetry proves the defendant was not speeding, nor did he cross the yellow line, directly contradicting Officer Mitchell's sworn testimony. On the screen, the red and blue lights flashed. The Explorer pulled over smoothly. The audio track kicked in, perfectly clear. The courtroom listened to the precise exchange David had with the officers. Then came the moment of the search. The camera angle shifted to the exterior driver's side, looking down from the B-pillar. Officer Mitchell was leaning into the car. "Please pause the video, Agent Carter. Zoom in on Officer Mitchell's right hand," David instructed. The image magnified in sharp 4K resolution. The courtroom watched, paralyzed in stunned silence, as the video clearly showed Mitchell reaching into the upper left breast pocket of his own tactical vest. His fingers pinched a small, clear plastic baggie filled with white crystals. He pulled it out of his own vest, reached into the open center console of the Explorer, dropped the baggie, and immediately pulled it back out. Well, Mitchell's voice echoed from the courtroom speakers, perfectly synced. "Looks like we caught ourselves a trafficker, Brad." A collective gasp rippled through the few civilians in the gallery. The bailiff's jaw was practically resting on his chest. "Agent Carter," David said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Did the Sentinel system's exterior microphones capture any audio from the officers while I was secured in the rear of their cruiser?" "Yes, sir," Carter replied. He clicked another file. The screen showed David sitting quietly in the back of the police car. Outside, standing near the trunk, Mitchell and Hayes were smoking cigarettes. "I told you, Brad," Mitchell's voice crackled through the speakers, dripping with malice. "You see an out-of-state plate, driven by one of these arrogant types. You always shake the tree. They always have cash to seize. We'll tag this Washington suit, impound the car, and the department gets to auction it. Chief's gonna love this." "What if he fights it?" Hayes' voice asked nervously. "Fights it with what?" Mitchell laughed cruelly. "It's our word against a minority from out of town in Caldwell's court. Caldwell will rubber stamp the conviction. Conley gets another notch on his belt, and we get the overtime. He's a nobody. Nobody is coming to save him." The audio cut out, leaving a suffocating silence in the courtroom. David turned away from the screen and looked directly at the prosecution table. Conley looked like he was about to physically vomit. He was shuffling papers aimlessly, his hands shaking violently. "Your Honor," Conley stammered, his voice cracking. The state of Oakhaven moves to immediately dismiss all charges against the defendant, with prejudice. We withdraw our case." "No," David said. The word struck like a thunderclap. Judge Caldwell blinked, desperate to regain control. "Mr. Sterling, the prosecution is dropping the charges. You are a free man. You may go. This court is adjourned." I said. No, David repeated, stepping into the center aisle, his posture radiating absolute authority. You do not get to sweep this under the rug, Judge Caldwell. You do not get to dismiss the charges and pretend this was an isolated incident. This was not a mistake. This was a coordinated, systemic conspiracy to deprive a United States citizen of their constitutional rights under the color of law, in direct violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Mr. Sterling, you are out of line, Caldwell shouted, banging his gavel futilely. The case is dismissed. Bailiff, clear the room. The bailiff didn't move an inch. He was staring terrified at Agent Carter, who had calmly stood up and placed a hand inside his suit jacket. You don't understand, Harrison, David said, dropping the "Your Honor" entirely. I am not just the defendant in this case, and I am not a civilian. David reached into his inner jacket pocket. He withdrew a flat leather wallet and flipped it open. The gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, sitting beside a laminated identification card. My name is David Sterling, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of the federal government. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you gentlemen have just perjured yourselves into a federal penitentiary. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Officer Bradley Hayes let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper and actually tried to stand up and bolt for the gallery doors. He didn't make it 2 steps. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, not with a polite push, but with the coordinated, overwhelming force of a federal raid. A dozen FBI special agents, wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the Bureau's yellow letters, flooded the aisles. They moved with terrifying precision, securing all exits in seconds. Nobody moves. FBI, keep your hands where we can see them, the lead tactical agent barked, his voice echoing off the wood panels. Mitchell remained frozen in his seat, his eyes wide, his tough guy facade completely shattered. He stared at David Sterling, realizing with sickening clarity that the nobody he had targeted, the man he had shoved against a hot hood and illegally handcuffed, was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the United States. Agent Carter stepped down from the witness stand, pulling a pair of heavy federal cuffs from his belt. He walked straight toward the gallery. Thomas Mitchell, Bradley Hayes, Carter said, his voice devoid of any emotion. You are under arrest for conspiracy to deprive civil rights, evidence tampering, aggravated perjury, and violation of the Hobbs Act. Stand up and turn around. Hayes offered his hands willingly, sobbing openly. Mitchell, still paralyzed by shock, had to be hauled to his feet by 2 tactical agents. The distinct click-clack of the handcuffs locking echoed loudly in the quiet room. Up at the prosecution table, Richard Conley was hyperventilating. Director Sterling, he gasped, holding his hands up defensively. I had no idea. I relied entirely on the sworn affidavits of the police department. I am a victim of their deception as well. David walked slowly toward the prosecution table, his eyes boring into Conley. Save it for the grand jury, Mr. Conley. We've been reviewing your prosecution records for the last 6 months. We found a statistical anomaly. Over 900 plea deals forced upon minority defendants in the last 3 years, all based on uncorroborated, single-officer testimonies involving miraculous discoveries of narcotics. You knew exactly what they were doing. You weaponized the judicial system to feed the county's Civil Asset Forfeiture Fund. Judge Caldwell gripped his gavel like a lifeline. Director, this is highly irregular. You cannot conduct a federal raid in a state courtroom without a warrant? David interrupted, pulling a thick envelope from his pocket and dropping it onto the prosecutor's table. Oh, we have warrants, Harrison, issued by the Chief Judge of the Federal Appellate Court at 3 o'clock this morning. As we speak, 200 federal agents are simultaneously executing search and seizure warrants at the Oak Haven Police Department headquarters, the mayor's office, and the county financial ledger vault. Caldwell slumped back in his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of him. He looked like an old, deflated man. "We followed the money, Judge," David continued, pacing the well of the court. "We saw how the impounded vehicles and seized cash from these illegal stops were funneled into a municipal slush fund, a fund that then paid out highly inflated municipal contracts to a construction firm owned by your brother-in-law. It's a textbook RICO violation. You turned this courthouse into an organized crime syndicate." The courtroom doors opened once more. Several more individuals in sharp federal suits entered, accompanied by heavily armed U.S. Marshals. Among them was Simon Fletcher, the deputy director of the FBI. He walked briskly down the aisle and handed David a secure tablet. "Director," Fletcher reported loudly enough for the room to hear, "the Oak Haven police chief has been taken into federal custody at his residence. The precinct is fully secured. The DOJ, Civil Rights Division, has officially initiated the federal takeover of the department. The Attorney General is preparing the press release." "Thank you, Simon," David said, handing the tablet back. David turned his attention back to the two officers currently being marched toward the exit. "Officer Mitchell," David called out. Mitchell stopped, looking back over his shoulder. His face was a mask of sheer terror. "You told me that I was in Oak Haven now, and that I didn't give the orders here," David said quietly, the stillness of his voice far more intimidating than a shout. "You were right about one thing. I don't give the orders in Oak Haven, but the United States Constitution does. And today, the bill for ignoring it has come due." Mitchell swallowed hard, unable to formulate a single word, before the agents shoved him out the doors and into the waiting transport vans. David looked around the courtroom, taking in the frightened faces of the remaining corrupt officials. The trap had sprung flawlessly. For years, Oak Haven had preyed on the vulnerable, the out-of-towners, the people who lacked the resources to fight back. They relied on fear, isolation, and a rigged system. They had just learned the hard way that sometimes the prey bites back. David unbuttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the exit, flanked by Agent Carter and Deputy Director Fletcher. He didn't look back at Judge Caldwell or Prosecutor Conley as federal agents moved in to secure their electronics and files. The cleanup of Oak Haven County was going to take years, but the rot had finally been excised. Stepping out of the stifling courthouse and into the bright morning sun, David Sterling took a deep breath of fresh air. His cell phone buzzed in his pocket, a direct line from the Attorney General. The work was far from over, but justice had finally arrived in Oak Haven. The fallout from the Oak Haven courthouse raid did not just make the evening news. It dominated the global news cycle for 6 straight weeks. Within 2 hours of the FBI securing the municipal building, the Department of Justice held a live, nationally televised press conference in Washington, D.C. The Attorney General, standing alongside Deputy Director Simon Fletcher, released the declassified footage from Asset Foxtrot 7 to the public. The internet exploded. The video of Officer Thomas Mitchell planting methamphetamine in the console of a vehicle driven by the director of the FBI became the most watched news clip of the decade. Late-night hosts mercilessly mocked the officers, while civil rights organizations mobilized massive legal teams. The agonizing hubris of Mitchell's recorded voice, sneering that David was a nobody and that nobody is coming to save him, was played on an endless loop across CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. It became a cultural touchstone, a stark, undeniable crystallization of systemic police corruption caught in 4K resolution. The ensuing federal investigation, spearheaded by Special Agent William Carter, tore Oak Haven down to its foundations. It was not just a few bad apples. The entire orchard was rotting. The DOJ uncovered a sprawling, intricate racket. For nearly a decade, the Oak Haven Police Department had functioned as a state-sponsored extortion ring. They specifically targeted out-of-state drivers, predominantly minorities, manufacturing probable cause to seize cash, vehicles, and assets. The money trail led exactly where David Sterling knew it would. Seized funds were laundered through a municipal equipment acquisition account, which then paid exorbitant consulting and construction fees to a shell company owned by Judge Harrison Caldwell's brother-in-law. Prosecutor Richard Conley was receiving under-the-table kickbacks for every rapid plea deal he secured, keeping the conviction rate artificially high and the forfeiture funds flowing without the pesky interference of actual trials. As the months dragged on, the karma hit the perpetrators with the force of a freight train. The American Civil Liberties Union and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed a historic class action lawsuit against Oak Haven County. Over 400 wrongful convictions were overturned in a matter of weeks. Hundreds of innocent people, previously coerced into accepting felony plea deals by Conley's aggressive tactics, had their records expunged and were released from state prisons. The county was forced to liquidate municipal assets to pay out over $80 million in civil settlements, effectively bankrupting the corrupt local government and placing the town under federal receivership. 14 months after the initial traffic stop on Route 119, the true reckoning arrived. The scene was no longer the dusty, wood-paneled state court where Harrison Caldwell had once played God. It was the sterile, imposing United States District Court in the state capitol. The Honorable Margaret Reynolds, a no-nonsense federal judge with a reputation for handing down maximum sentences to corrupt officials, presided over the courtroom. David Sterling sat quietly in the back row of the gallery. He wore a simple navy suit, attending not in his official capacity as director, but as the primary victim and star witness. The defendants were led into the courtroom by heavily armed United States Marshals. The transformation was jarring. Officer Thomas Mitchell and Officer Bradley Hayes, once the arrogant predators of the highway, were now shackled at the wrists and ankles, wearing ill-fitting, bright orange federal prison jumpsuits. Mitchell had lost 50 pounds. His face was gaunt, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Hayes looked completely broken, his shoulders slumped in permanent defeat. Richard Conley, disbarred and disgraced, looked 10 years older, his hair completely white. Harrison Caldwell, stripped of his black robe and his dignity, kept his eyes glued to the floor. They had all pleaded guilty, going to trial against the combined weight of the FBI, the DOJ, and the undeniable biometric evidence was a mathematical impossibility. Now, they were just waiting for the final drop of the gavel. Judge Reynolds did not hold back. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a brazen, despicable abuse of the public trust, Judge Reynolds announced, her voice echoing with righteous fury. You weaponized the badge, the law, and the judicial system to terrorize the very citizens you swore to protect. You targeted the vulnerable for personal profit. You thought you were untouchable. She looked directly at the former police officers. Thomas Mitchell, for conspiracy to violate civil rights, aggravated perjury, and evidence tampering. You are sentenced to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Bradley Hayes, for your role in this conspiracy and failure to intervene, you are sentenced to 14 years. Mitchell collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his shackled hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The tough guy was gone forever. Richard Conley, the judge continued, for extortion under the color of official right and conspiracy, you are sentenced to 12 years. And Harrison Caldwell, for violating the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act and orchestrating this criminal enterprise from the bench, you are sentenced to 25 years. The bang of Judge Reynolds's gavel was deafening. It sounded like a vault door slamming shut. As the marshals hauled the sobbing, ruined men out of the courtroom to begin their decades behind bars, David Sterling stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply felt the quiet satisfaction of a broken mechanism being repaired. The trap he had walked into on Route 119 had not only saved him, but it had liberated an entire county from tyranny. David turned and walked out of the federal courthouse, stepping into the bright, unclouded afternoon light, ready to return to Washington. The system had finally worked, because this time, the right man had been holding the scales. The Oak Haven scandal became a stark warning for corrupt precincts nationwide. David Sterling's daring sting operation proved that the badge is a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the prejudiced. Justice, though sometimes delayed, can strike with devastating precision. The predators of Route 119 finally learned that true authority doesn't shout from a rigged bench. It whispers from the inescapable, unyielding crush of the federal hammer.